Over to you, Shaminda.
Thank you, Neil. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone. So welcome everybody to the first Race, Gender and Sexualities research seminar and the last in October for the Black History Month events. So it's a combination of the two, organized with Equinet. And today we have Sami Pinarbasi, who will be speaking on the campaign to remove the statue of Robert Peel in Manchester. Sami is currently investigating LSBU's connections to slavery, imperialism, and colonialism, and his research interests include a micro-historical focus on Manchester in the 18th and 19th centuries, capitalism, slavery and abolition, and digital humanities. With the ongoing debate about statues of problematic figures of the past being so divisive, Sami shares his thoughts on the matter and why he's taking action. And the session will also explore popular understandings of Robert Peel and his historic legacy. So the floor is yours, Sami.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. Can you see my slide?
We can.
Okay, great. So just before I start, I'd like to just offer content warning. Some of the words and ideas contained in this talk might be offensive to modern ears. So just be aware of that. Thank you. So the pigeon magnet of Piccadilly, Greater Manchester's own Sir Robert Peel, 2nd Baronet, stands atop a plinth on a series of steps in 2021, a bigot made of bronze. His face ennobled with haughtiness and his deportment confident, jaunty, almost ironically Byronic for a Conservative politician. Below him sits two subsidiary figures holding emblems of industry, the art, and of course cotton. As a statue on the plinth, it conveys the monumental status of a solitary and isolated hero standing alone in the middle of Manchester. The statue, and even historiography, only tells half the story. The wealth that projected Peel into politics and fame was based on the exploitation of enslaved Black people in both North America and the British West Indies. The provenance of Peel's wealth cannot be ignored. Thus, this paper will analyse the role that Sir Robert Peel played in the lead up to emancipation in 1833, his legacy in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, and his Manchester-based statue. I will attempt to shed new light on the phrase Peelian principles. Robert Peel and his statue represent a nexus of historical and contemporary issues such as race, capitalism, modern policing, free trade, slavery, and industrialization. There are at least 9 statues of the man, more than of any other non-royal in Britain. This alone is testimony to the man's powerful legacy and influence. Indeed, the volume of monuments dedicated to Sir Robert Peel have been described as a forest of statues. The 1850s were a crucial decade for statue mania in industrial towns, according to Paul A. Pickering and Alex Tyrrell. To help grasp the importance of the Peel statue, it is vital to place it in its socio-political context. The statue occupies an ideological space which represents modernity, free trade, industrialization, and capitalism, and their connection to the ideas of globalization, colonialism, cotton, and imperialism. Today, the statue inhabits a physical space in the center of a global city. Manchester depended upon global connections for its cotton-based wealth, and the same could be said for the Peel family. The city itself is a monument to colonialism, slavery, and the plantation economy. This naturally leads to a retelling of the story of Peel and his statue through the intellectual prism of modernity, which Doreen Massey reflects in its preconditions in and effects of violence, racism, and oppression. The physical centering of the statue must not be accompanied by the continued centering of Peel's violent, racist, and oppressive ideology, as has happened in the past. Instead, as Stuart Hall tells us, we must attempt a re-narrativization which displaces a story of capitalist modernity from its European centering to its dispersed global peripheries. The post-colonial focus must now be on the lives, experiences, and legacies of the multitude of unknown and forgotten enslaved people that picked the cotton which made the Peels wealthy. The faded bronze form of the great 19th century statesman symbolizes the global sense of place and signifies real relations with real content, economic, political, and cultural, between Manchester and the wider world in which it exists. Peel's statue has been clearly defined by a contestation over ideas, economic systems, and it's a subject of conflicts over heritage and memory today. Even today, I would argue that the free market and capitalistic tenets that the statue represents also help solidify neoliberalism's value in the 21st century. The belief that then as now, that a deregulated global market would be the tide that lifted all boats. Yet at the statue's unveiling, the connection between the global and local were recognised by Alderman Sub John Potter, chairman of the Peel Monument Committee, who addressed the multitude by saying, quote, "The measures of Sir Robert Peel have been fruitful of benefits to the people and measures and benefits to the trade of the empire. That commerce is carried and with it civilization to the farthest quarters of the world," end quote. During his lifetime, Peel supposedly represented and embraced modernism, a modernism which meant free trade. Even in the 1950s, even in the 1850s, the statue itself seemed to represent contested ideas more than the man himself, with the Tory radical Richard Osler declaring that, quote, "You've been called upon to subscribe your pen to the erection of a monument to the memory of the late Sir Robert Peel. It is not the private virtues of the deceased man that you ask to perpetuate. The leader of the popular mind, so-called, asks that you thus endorse by your signature the free trade policy of which the late Right Honourable Baronet was the reputed leader." Even in the 19th century, as Richard Scott reminds us, statues of Robert Peel were controversial sites of veneration and commemoration, with Peel's statue in Parliament Square, London, being the most prominent example. The history of this particular statue, with its interminable delays, political infighting, administrative wrangling, financial hand-wringing, is emblematic of the wider difficulties attending the sighting of Peel in the popular and historical memory. Michael Taylor has described Peel as the Duke of Wellington's most trusted lieutenant. Wellington was a notoriously high Tory reactionary and pro-slavery figure. As Wellington's Home Secretary, he would establish the Metropolitan Police Service in 1829. It cannot be a coincidence that the pro-slavery and anti-black Peel would have founded the police. British police have been described as institutionally racist and accused of having a profound problem with discrimination and prejudice at an institutional level. The killing of black people at the hand of the police is all too easy for politicians and others to dismiss as a uniquely American problem. It is comforting to assume that police brutality and racism does not exist in Britain. After all, we have a Prime Minister who has declared that Britain is not a racist country, and only recently has Cressida Dick, the Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police, denied that the force was institutionally racist. In 2017, the Lamb report found that in England and Wales, black people make up 3% of the overall population, yet they currently represent 12% of the prison population. While it's claimed that in 2018 to 2019, black people within Greater Manchester police jurisdiction were searched 7 times more than white people. And according to a Freedom of Information request, there were 542 public complaints of racism directed towards Greater Manchester Police by members of the public. The killing of George Floyd in 2020 helped bring the world's attention to such issues. To defenestrate the statue of Sir Robert Peel would be an iconoclastic moment. Such moments in these movements always provide the careful observer with a sharp view of the stresses and tears in the social fabric of a given time or place. These stresses and tears are long pent-up frustrations within civil society that erupt into social movements, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, when marginalized people within the society are misrepresented, marginalized, and oppressed, and resultantly direct their anger and frustration towards icons which perpetuate the narrative that movements wish to challenge and change. Photos and videos of angry protesters vandalizing and pulling down statues have permeated the media's coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests since summer of 2020. This led to the authorities placing protected boxes around the statues throughout Britain, with the most prominent example of this being the boxing up of Churchill on the 12th of June 2020. The next day, the Peel statue in Tamworth was similarly entombed in a wooden box. On the 7th of June 2020, Black Lives Matter activists toppled a statue of slave trader Edward Colston, dragging it through the streets and summarily plunging it into a nearby river. Since then, countless statues have been removed and streets have been renamed throughout Britain. This new civil rights era, which was ushered in by the protests of summer 2020, have created an opportunity for critical debate over the interpretation of history and how we remember and the figures, ideas, and events the statues and memorials commemorate. Rather than listening to activists and reckoning with this moment in British history, the Conservative government has instead suggested that there can be no justification for defacing statues and symbols, and thus put forward the Police Crime and Sentence and Court Bill, which proposes an increase in the maximum penalty for criminal damage from 3 months to 10 years imprisonment. The justification being that it has been long considered that the law is not sufficiently robust in this area. The government also announced in January 2020 that they intended to require planning permission for the removal. In January 2021, that they intend to require the planning permission for the removal of any statue, giving all statues the same status as the buildings. Any removal will now be subject to bureaucratic delays and vetoes, with the Community Secretary, Robert Jenrick, declaring that, quote, "We cannot and should not now try to edit or censor our past. That's why I'm changing the law to protect historical monuments and ensure that we don't repeat the errors of previous generations, losing our inheritance of the past without process or care. Like our collective understanding of the past, statues are not objective or neutral. And we select that with what we remember. Memory can be described as a selection, and its presentation in the form of statues and monuments make it all the more so. I think someone might have their microphone on. Memory can be described as a selection, and its presentation in the form of statues and monuments make it even more so. Who a statue or monument remembers is important. Peel is remembered, yet the colonized are not. Statues are thus very much about boundary making. They can mark who belongs and who is the other. The contestations over the Robert Peel statue continue into the 21st century. As stated by Ana Lucia Araujo, quote, "The public memory of slavery is a permanent battleground. I am a militant campus woke and resultantly have been denounced as a statue terrorist, history terrorist, and even a violent protester for starting the peaceful Repeal Peel campaign. These slurs has only spurred on my campaign, which began with the circulation of a petition on the 5th of June 2020, merely days before Colson fell in Bristol. As an anti-racist historian and activist, I feel a personal responsibility to use my academic knowledge of Robert Peel and Manchester's connections to the British West Indies and the plantation economy to try and effect meaningful change by challenging and contesting the historical perception of Robert Peel. The Repeal Peel campaign has led to Manchester City Council to initiate a statue review, according to Araujo. According to Araujo, quote, "In this struggle, men and women demanding the removal and renaming of tangible markers commemorating pro-slavery individuals are also decrying entrenched structures of white supremacy that perpetuate racial inequalities and racism. Still, although their interventions are shaped by locals and national contexts, in societies shaped by white supremacy, not only are their actions and discourses carrying similar elements, but the responses to the activism by governments, institutions, and elite groups designed as white often also present significant similarities." To understand Peel's pro-slavery views, it is essential to examine the origins of the Peel family. Robert Peel helped to build up Cottonopolis and vice versa. He was the grandson of a Lancastrian yeoman turned calico printer, Robert Parsley Peel, 1723 to 1795, who died in 1795 worth around £140,000. But his father, also called Robert Peel, 1750 to 1830, was the first cotton king to sit in Parliament. He was described by the press as one of the richest commoners in England. Peel was the calico printing, while Arkwright was the spinning. Here you can see an image of Peel Street in Manchester, and Peel Street is with the red building surrounding it. The Peels were the leading investors in factory production in the northwest of England in the late 18th century, establishing no fewer than 22 cotton spinning mills in Lancashire and Staffordshire. Peel Street in 1806 was on the outskirts of the town, and the entire site was rented for £14 a year. Because land was so cheap, Peel Senior thus erected a warehouse in this location and drew business to that part of Manchester. Everyone wished to have a warehouse near Peel, and the countless buildings that sprouted up around Peel Street. The warehouse itself was valued at £10,800 in 1795. Here are 2 pages from Robert Parsley Peel's patent book, The Grandfather. The international connections of the Peels are foundational to their vast wealth, evidenced by the fact that they sold directly to cotton and to American merchants. American domestic markets demanded lower-priced cotton, common sort prints, which manufacturers were able to supply at a competitive price. Between 1785 and 1791, the Peel sales in North America comprised of prints costing between 1 shilling and 6p and 3 shillings and 6p a yard, but was most frequently sold in the 2 shillings to 6p bracket. Here's a graph which shows the number of customers and total sales of the Peel family. The high-quality goods which the Peels sold which the Peels were renowned for was produced using sea island cotton, which was solely available in the United States. Regrettably, Peel Jr.'s family destroyed his father's destroyed his father's records upon his death in 1830, so it's impossible to know how many of the family's American customers were planters or slavers. How much this cotton was sold on the west coast of Africa for slaves, or to what extent the manufactured goods ended up on plantations themselves. This may have been a deliberate act. Peel, it could be said, has erased history. So this image shows Robert Peel, the Home Secretary, controlling King George IV through a complex steam machine. One observer opined that, quote, in a question relating to the cotton trade, it is natural to think of the House of Peel. Prior to the mechanization of spinning, the Peels already occupied a leading role in the industry as putting out manufacturers, employing many thousands of spinners and weavers in their homes. By 1785, the Peels employed 6,800 work people, paid an annual excise of £20,000. Peel did not follow his grandfather or father into the family business, and within a few weeks of his coming of age in February 1809, his father used his influence with the Portland Ministry to secure a seat for him in the House of Commons. It is impossible to discern just how Peel arrived at his sympathetic pro-slavery stance and attitude towards the West India interest. It is likely that the influence of his cotton manufacturing father swayed him in that direction. Peel Sr. circulated a pro-slavery petition in Manchester in 1806 in the vain attempt to demonstrate the city's supposed pro-slavery sympathies. It only garnered a measly 111 signatures. He also believed that Africans are not sufficiently matured by civilization to enjoy freedom, and that liberty given to those incapable of appreciating it was, quote, like placing a sword in the hand of a madman. Shockingly, Peel even suggests that some slaves might not want freedom and prefer to remain enslaved. Quote, and I come to the plan of the Right Honourable Secretary, who proposed that the slave should be apprenticed for 12 years to his master, but that the slave shall be entitled to demand his freedom at any intermediate time on tendering a certain fixed value. But suppose that some slaves might not wish to demand their freedom at any time, but should prefer remaining as they were, what would follow? Why, then there would be two classes, one of slaves and one of apprentices, and for the one, the whole slave code was to have still to be continued. Would that be a great and inconvenient? Would that not be a great and inconvenient anomaly? End quote. It is possible to describe Robert Peel as a gradualist. However, gradualism can be interpreted as an attempt to kick emancipation so far into the long grass that it would be delayed indefinitely. The distinction between pro-slavery and gradualist is blurred, to say the least. Indeed, Stephen Mullen has described gradual abolition as a historical misnomer. Andrew Thompson, an abolitionist, gave a notable speech at the meeting of the Edinburgh Society for the Abolition of Slavery in 1830, where he declared that, quote, let us petition for gradual emancipation, said the advocates for that plan. We cannot expect to get anything more. Immediate emancipation will not be granted. Why? So if we complacently put our cases in the hand of the ministers, it appears from the language of Sir Robert Peel that we should get neither the one nor the other. The debate over emancipation is a useful example of how Peel combined political expediency with doctrinal flexibility. He threw his lot in with the pro-slavery cause, but by 1833 had eventually accepted the inevitability of full abolition. The leader of the House of Commons for the Whig government, Lord Althorp, insightfully observed this by replying, quote, the only difference between the course recommended by the right honourable gentleman and that proposed by the government was in point of time. Bridget Hawley notes this change in approach, saying that in a sense, everyone was an opponent of slavery now, even those who wanted a slower process of emancipation. The 1830s were characterised by intensive pro-slavery efforts, which shifted from the defence of slavery to attempt to shape the emancipation process and societies it would produce. Despite this, Peel was still concerned about emancipation, which he viewed through a racialised prism. He averred that any fundamental change to colonial society, which emancipation would result in, as fundamentally hazardous, and that the, quote, object would not be to pass a hasty vote recognising the expediency and justice of Negro emancipation, but to alter safely and prudently the state of a society in a hemisphere different from that in which they themselves lived, to amalgamate two distinct separate races and supply a better stimulus to Negro labour, that the old base and degrading stimulus of the whip, in the climate which he inhabits, the great blessing of life is the absence of labour, that labour for which you are now attempting to create in his mind a stimulus. The climate of the West Indies and the racial demography of the islands was a veritable tinderbox ready to explode in violence, according to Peel. Peel's references to the dangers of amalgamating two distinct and separate races emphasises British society's fear of miscegenation and the existence of an indirect sexual tie to white power. The mixed ethnicity people in the British West Indies were uncomfortably juxtaposed between the higher and lower rungs of colonial society, between the completely free and enslaved, and between white and non-white. This also feeds into the white supremacist blood ideology of European familial relations in the 18th and 19th centuries, which reinforced indirect sexual ties, though the ideology downgraded blood ties resulting from miscegenation. Peel even refers to colonists as, quote, who were so closely connected with England in blood and in interest. The fears of two races mixing played into the patriarchal idea of white supremacy, which required the social isolation of all white women, irrespective of class, from intimacy with the black male in order to minimise threat of miscegenation. A clear link is made to racial difference and violence once again in one of Peel's speeches. He suggests that emancipation, quote, might lead to a misconstruction of the intentions of the government, both by the whites and the blacks, might widen the gulf of which presently existed between them, might make the slaves still more impatient of slavery, might, by the excitement of false hopes, encourage them to resistance and leave us with no alternative but to put them down again by physical force and delay the time for giving them, with any prospect of safety or danger, the blessing of freedom. Today, Peel is remembered for founding the Metropolitan Police in 1829, and to a lesser extent for his role in the Irish famine and the free trade movement of the mid-19th century. His attitude towards slavery and emancipation is less well known. It is hoped that this paper has shed light on the complex relationship that Peel has had with the existence of slavery in the British West Indies. Peel's untimely death in 1850 led to what all art historians have identified as the beginning of a countrywide statue mania, the results of which we are reckoning with in this era of Black Lives Matter. As Terry White puts it, at its most fundamental, the purpose of such statuary was to encourage an active and responsible citizenship. The individual placed on the pedestal being the moral exemplar, reminder of a secular gospel, which proclaimed the openness and possibilities of new industrial society. The statue was also contested in the 1850s. Radicals objected to the memorialization of a man associated with intolerance, bigotry, and political repression. In 1938, a Manchester alderman, George Hall, suggested that all statues be removed from Albert Square and Piccadilly to a memorial corner in Heaton Park. Quote, all these statues, Mr. Hall believes, have lost or are losing their point with people today, who would far rather see in the centre of Albert Square in particular, he is convinced, a well laid out garden. While nearly 2 years later, to aid the war effort, the bronze statues in Manchester could have produced around 2.5 tons of metal and used as munitions as a memorial to Hitler. The Peel statue also featured in a British Pathé newsreel film about expendable metal. The city's built environment would be a lot less problematic had this plan been followed through. Alex von Tunzelmann highlights the man of his time argument, which suggests that the historical figures commemorated in the statues were acceptable in their own time. This argument is, according to Tunzelmann, it is itself a way of erasing history. There is a distinct lack of evidence for these assumptions. There were no opinion polls conducted between 1787 and 1833, but we do know that abolitionism was an ideology propped up by mass mobilization. It included well-attended meetings, hundreds of anti-slavery societies established, widely circulated publications, petitions by hundreds of thousands of people, and in the election of 1831 to 1832, dozens of abolitionist MPs elected to Parliament. Peel was so extreme that he carried the torch for the pro-slavery cause, even after members of the West Indian interest had given up on it. Peel's statue occupies a vital public space within the centre of a metropole. It delineates the connection between history and memory. Temporality is an intrinsically property of the statue itself. Over time, landscapes change, surroundings change, values change, people change, yet the statue and what it embodies stays the same. It is a jarring reality that the statue has not been altered since its erection in the mid-19th century. Our relationship to statues also changes. Even Peel himself changed in his attitude towards slavery, at least. Peel made anti-slavery overtures in the 1840s as the pro-slavery ideology was so repellent it became a taboo after emancipation occurred in the British Empire. There was not much political, economic, cultural, and moral capital to be accrued by associating oneself with the anti-slavery cause. He had also realised that the moral impulses of the nation had been mobilised in the 1830s, constituted a crucial thread in the reconfiguration of the sense of the nation into a new understanding of Britishness. What didn't change, however, was Peel's racialised view of the free black population of the British West Indies. After emancipation, he maintained that, quote, "The Negroes have not yet come round to regular habits of working. It is, however, a diminution and difficulty only temporary, I apprehend, which will soon, therefore, be at an end." Historians have always pointed to Peel's fluctuation of opinion, which is evident in his attitude towards anti-slavery in the 1830s and 1840s. He opposed the ideology prior to emancipation, yet embraced it during his premiership. This is an exemplar of the paradoxical legacy of Peel. Peel's ministry forced many nations to adopt emancipation during his premiership and used the Royal Navy to hunt slave ships, but this was done as part of informal empire, whereby Britain was using its military strength to diplomatically pressure smaller nations in order to gain economic, political, and cultural domination over them. It was a profitable enterprise. In the late 19th century, one popular opinion was that Peel was an honorary, though not especially honoured Whig, whom parentage had placed him in the wrong party. This does not line up with the abolitionist view of Peel, who squarely placed him in the Tory pro-slavery tradition. Peel is acknowledged as a liberal Tory. This faction was not ideologically demonstrative, but possessed a fairly coherent set of beliefs with the notion that one could only strip away monopolies and other indices of control. Society would thus regulate itself and would do in such a way as not to eliminate, but at least to make sense of societal problems. Though that is not to say that Peel was a humanitarian. In a speech in Tamworth in 1841, Peel recognised the popularity of anti-slavery and aligned himself to it by stating that, quote, "It is now a matter of very little difference whether the party who acted with Pitt was in favour of the slave trade and slavery, or whether they were not. The question now is whether, after the sacrifices which this country has made for the suppression of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery, and the glorious results that have ensued, are likely to ensue from these sacrifices. Peel is wrong. For history and posterity's sake, it matters. It mattered in 1841 as it matters in 2021. That Britain is waging war on its history and erasing its past are common arguments, inferring that removing statues is an attempt to destroy history itself. Boris Johnson said in 2020, "We cannot now try to edit or censor our past. We cannot pretend to have a different history." But the reality is that, Simon Sharma notes, statues are not history, rather its opposite. History is argument, statues book none. They lord over civil space, shut off debate and through their invitation to reverence. Pulling down statues does not erase history. All these histories still exist. The public understanding of history depends on much more significant factors such as education, strong historical and heritage institutions, archival preservation and access, critical thinking, and freedom of speech. Ultimately, modern campaigns which are targeted statues, such as the Repeal Peel campaign, help to challenge legacies of colonialism, racism, and slavery. Such campaigns are open to criticism, and there's been plenty of that. My activism does not end with statues. Real change will not be achieved with purely symbolic acts. We can all get involved in history, as societies, communities, families, and individuals. You've involved yourself by listening to my talk. You may disagree with me on a few things or the whole thing, and that's okay. Ultimately, no version of history can be set in stone forever. Perhaps the most powerful statements of who we are right now are the empty plinths where great men once stood. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sami, for a really, really insightful and interesting presentation. Thank you. We now have time for questions. So I'm going to throw open the floor. If you do have a question, you are very welcome to pop your camera and microphone on to ask a live question. Alternatively, you are welcome to use the chat box. So let's get those underway. If anyone has one, please do feel free to pop up. Sami, I'll kick us off. How did you end up doing what you do now?
In terms of
history, kind of like what led you in that direction?
Basically, history was the only topic I was good at school. Okay. So that's the reason why I kind of got interested in history, really. And I was also going on a lot of cruises when I was a kid with my family, and we always used to go around the Caribbean. And so that was really my interest in the Caribbean, really stemmed from that, going to all these like plantations and historical sites, really like piqued my interest in history when I was a lot younger. So.
And did you expect it? Did you expect to kind of end up doing what you're doing now this far along, kind of?
Not really, no. I mean, I didn't really have any like grand plans in terms of my own life regarding history, but I just kind of led towards doing a PhD and then going into academia, really. So it wasn't really a set plan, but.
Okay, thank you. Shaminda.
Oh, you're muted.
Did Michael want to ask a question for me? Who's on before me?
Oh.
Kind. Sami, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because two of the reasons that you give for no longer celebrating Peel or for removing a statue is one, that we founded the Metropolitan Police in 1829, and the second, although you maybe didn't say it here, is that you founded the Conservative Party in 1834. This will be a retort whenever you make those points. Is that how far can Peel, who died in 1850, be held responsible for whatever iniquities we might see in those institutions today? Because somebody could well ask or suggest that's like blaming Keir Hardie for the efflorescence of anti-Semitism in Labour under Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for that question. I think there's like a historical link, really. I mean, there's a historical legacy there. I mean, you can't deny that legacy when Peel kind of, he created the police, and he created like 12 points of policing, didn't he? His Peelian principles. But those kind of principles were, they were great principles in theory, but in reality, they weren't really enacted in places outside of mainland Britain, were they? Like Peelian principles didn't really exist in India, in Ireland, in Africa. So I think it's quite interesting, really, the ways in which Peel can be held responsible in some ways. I think. I mean, I understand that he died in 1850, so it's hard to like say, oh, it's all his fault, but we can't deny the linkages there between pro-slavery ideology, policing, the Conservative Party. I mean, the fact that the Conservative Party and police were founded by white supremacists, those facts can't be ignored, no matter how hard you try.
No, you certainly can't deny that Peel was pro-slavery and that he founded those things. But I think in order to make that case, you're going to need to produce, a lot of consequential evidence which shows that those institutions have an almost 200-year history, a consistent 200-year history infused with his ideology. I think that's the only way you can make that argument stick. But I may be wrong.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I've got to come up with the goods really, and I'm releasing an article soon on Peel, so hopefully that'll answer some of the questions. But thank you for your question, though. It was nice to meet you too. Finally.
Okay, so I'll ask my question. Well, I think it's probably somebody who's written it already in the chat. Where are you with the campaign? And my own question was, you said that statues aren't neutral. Part of what you said. What would you say to someone who says that statues are just part of British history?
Well, I see the distinction between history and historical objects. I mean, how can a statue be history? You don't learn history from a statue. It's just a bit of bronze or stone on a plinth. I don't understand how. I mean, these statues aren't really contextualized either. So it's not like we're learning from a plaque that they put on the statue itself. So I think we've got to make a distinction between history and historical. That's just my opinion now.
Okay. I mean, if somebody just said, this is just part of our history, and you never noticed the statue before, do you think the Black Lives Matter movement, made people more aware of this as well? And, people saying that just by getting rid of a statue, you're not erasing anything, you're not making it right. But, you're campaigning to remove the statue for that particular reason, aren't you?
Yeah.
So where are you with the campaign anyway?
The campaign it seems to be like in a deep freeze at the moment. Manchester City Council is supposed to be doing a statue review, and they announced this last summer, and it's still, I don't know what's happening with it. I tried emailing the councillors, and I'm not really getting much of an answer, and it's just, I think there's like slow walking it. Hopefully that what they're thinking is, I hope the whole thing goes away and they can just like carry on as normal. But ultimately, like, I don't envision a statue coming down, but I just thought, why not start a campaign and see what happens.
Okay.
I always think there's something quite symbolic about the fact that they're on a plinth and on a pedestal, and that being the problematic thing in itself, is that they're just there and glorified without any explanation as to what the history is. So even that simple act of them being on a plinth and on a pedestal in bronze, gold, whatever, that is the problematic thing to me. They're raised above people. They're, yes, it's symbolic, and yes, taking them down doesn't remove the history, but there is a glorification around that person being up high in itself. So maybe I'm looking at it from a really symbolic point of view, but that matters.
Yeah, you make a great point there. I mean, there's a statue of Robert Peel in London. I mean, I'm guessing, can anyone guess where it is? No, it's in Parliament Square. Right. But the fact that there's a statue of him in London, like, I didn't even know that until a few months ago. So just the fact that there's a statue of him in London and no one knows about it, no one really cares either. So it's just, it seems to be these people, these bigots kind of lord over our public spaces. Like we and in a really uncritical way, we interpret them at the moment, because they're just like left there with no plaques, no contextualization or anything.
Yeah, maybe that's the
things will change, but yeah,
that is the problem. The contextualization. It could say something right next to the statue. I'm going to have to stop talking in a minute. But it doesn't actually quite say the correct thing. So if we're looking at legacies of slavery and slave ownership, that's not plastered all over the writing next to the statue, because if it was, then there would be a different thing altogether. But it's not exactly telling the truth.
No, I think that would go some way. I think we're far enough along now that a lot of people would accept that would at least address part of the issue. I think when you look at it, I think if people have understanding and it is contextualized, I think that would address some of people's issues with these statues, and it's not a difficult thing to do.
But I think it would be the easy way to get out of the situation is just put a plaque on it. But I think they should have put a plaque on it before all this kicked off.
The conversation aside, on a personal view, tear them down. I don't care. Like, that's a personal view, not connected to my role at LSBU, but that's how I feel about them. So, but let's move away from that. Nico asks, what is the connection between your proposal and overcoming equality for Black and minority ethnic British citizens, including addressing material issues such as poor housing, lower incomes, and poorer educational outcomes?
That's a really interesting question. I think my issue is the fact that Robert Peel, he kind of represents capitalism, because he was like an ultra capitalist back in his day. He was the person who really, he was like a hero of he was on the plinth for the capitalists of his day, 19th century capitalists, and he kind of perpetuated this idea of like industrialization and capitalism synergizing and connecting together. So I think, the things that you mentioned, such as like material issues, such as poor housing, low incomes, poor educational outcomes, they're all connected to capitalism. And I think if we challenge the historical memory of Peel and the statue, and I think in some ways that is connected to challenging the status quo. Obviously, just tearing a statue down won't materially change people's lives. Obviously, I'm not that naive, but I think in some ways it helps start a conversation about these issues, helps ignite a debate, like a debate we're having now. So I think it's important to see the possibilities. I mean, if a statue comes down, the possibility is open for further change, radical change or not, or incremental change, I don't know, but change nonetheless.
Yeah, and it doesn't. I guess it doesn't even have to have a direct connection. Doing this equals this, but it's just the links between them. Like you said, it's that link to capitalism. It's that link to equality and stuff. So thank you. Linda also says tear them down. Does anyone else have any questions at all? Please do feel free to pop your cameras and microphone on. If not, we will come over to you, Sami, for closing words. We'll just give people a second or two.
There's somebody who wants to come in, Adrian, I think.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Adrian.
Hello, hi. Neil. Hi, Sami. Thanks for that. Very interesting. I wanted to, if I may, just to flesh out this question about tearing them down, and this argument that you deprive people of a bit of British history, and these sorts of arguments. I think there are ways of removing statues. Neil made the point about them being on plinths and looking down on the rest of us, but most of us have forgotten why they're looking down. But the people who haven't forgotten are most likely to be the descendants of oppressed people. They're more aware, I would imagine, that Geoffrey in the Museum of the Family, is it called, or the Museum of Childhood in the top of the city, in the bottom of Hackney, was a slave owner. And what I wanted to draw attention to was the campaign against the Geoffrey statue, because it's not what's being argued there is you can continue to learn from history by having Geoffrey not on a plinth overlooking the road, and every Black person who walks by has to look at a slave owner who became a philanthropist. But you put him in a box in the back of the museum and have lots of educational material, so you're not reinforcing people's oppression every moment of the day when they walk past. And that relates to the question that Sami answered from Nico about this connection between the Black Lives Matter and tearing down statues and such like, and wider questions of emancipation. Because if we win these battles, the linking thing is confidence. If we can win a battle on something, we can win on other things. We won't necessarily, of course. We've got a whole history of defeats. We're very good at defeating ourselves, but we won't win unless we engender a little bit of confidence. I always think, in the Marxist tradition of class consciousness, that's only one part of it. Class confidence, and in this context, BAME confidence is important. That's why I think it's vital that they are torn down, but they're not simply done by the state. We need to keep the pressure up. We need to make them act. Of course, they're not going to just be done by the state, but it's our actions that that can achieve that. And I think the whole thing about the Jeffrey Museum is now, it's not called it was when I went, it was the Museum of Fashion and the Family and Household or something or other, you know, households through the ages with lots of types of wallpaper and furniture and so on. But that's a pretty big campaign. You know, Diane Abbott has led a demonstration there, hundreds of people on Saturday afternoons, stand up to racism, other groups and so on and so forth. Really very vibrant local campaign. I think that's the way to do it. And I just wondered, as a question for Sami, have you had demonstrations? Is there a sort of groundswell of opinion, leaving Parliament Square aside, but in the Manchester Square, is there anything?
Yeah, last year we had a Making History March. So we had volunteers from Extinction Rebellion, Stand Up to Racism, some other groups as well. And we went around Manchester, like putting like custom-made plaques on these statues and like giving speeches and stuff. That was quite good. But this year there hasn't been as much, and it's I mean, I need to try and get a popular campaign going, really. But I don't understand. I thought it might have like kicked off, you know, sparked something with this Peel statue, because Peel, I mean, compare Peel to this Jeffrey guy. I mean, Peel defined the 19th century. He basically was one of the largest figures in 19th century British history. He helped define the careers of people like Gladstone and Disraeli. I mean, they all followed in his footsteps, really, for the rest of the 19th century. So I don't understand why Peel's name isn't as big as Rhodes or Geoffrey or these other people. But,
Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. Nico? You're on mute.
I think my question's been asked, actually. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you. Matthew?
Hi. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'd just like to ask a little bit about forces of counter-mobilization, those who are opposed tearing down Peel. First of all, I was just wondering too, if, you know, what are there modern day Peels? Are they, I mean, his direct descendants? Do you know who they are? Are they still an established, well-to-do family? Have they had anything to say about tearing down a statue of one of their ancestors? And also, too, I mean, just thinking about the fact that you do have this sort of counter-mobilization against tearing down statues. I mean, it's, you know, in ways it's interesting. If you look at city centres, the buildings are torn down all the time. Different bits of, you know, what we might, if we're going to say these physical objects are history, then you don't have to live in a city very long before you see your history being ripped down and trashed in front of you in the name of progress. Not that I'm objecting. And I was wondering too, are do you get are the objections to this more from a traditionalist right view? Are there any traditionalist left who are arguing against it? So just the two things, which you may not be able to answer, but one, who are the modern day Peels? Who are his descendants? Do they have any power or influence? And the other is, what is the nature of who are your opponents?
Yeah, thank you for two interesting questions, Matthew. The first question is, I mean, there are modern day Peels around. There's quite a lot of them, actually. I had one modern day Peel contact me from Canada last year, saying on Twitter, actually, saying that she supported my campaign and that she wanted the statue to come down of her ancestor. And that's quite interesting. And also, one of the Peel's ancestors, one of the Peel's descendants is was a guard of the Queen. So he guarded the Queen as like a part of her security detail, which I thought was quite interesting. The only reason I know that is because he quit his job recently. So that was in like Daily Mail. Also, counter protesters or people on the opposite side of this debate. Yeah, I mean, the people who are on the opposite side of this debate tend to be like institutional opponents. So they just like politicians, MPs. You know, Christopher Pincher, who's the current MP for Tamworth, which is Robert Peel's seat. I showed some of his tweets at the end of my speech, my talk, and he's obviously doesn't think I got my history right, which is quite ironic because he's actually wrong about Peel. But in terms of like left opposition, there's not any I can think of. There's one person I know of who opposed my campaign in Liverpool. He's quite left wing, but he's a tour guide in Liverpool. So he like shows people around the statues in Liverpool. So he's like opposed to any statues coming down whatsoever. But he's like opposed to even Edward Colston coming down. So perhaps there's like a financial interest as to why these statues should stay up. But that's the only person like who's left wing that I've come across who's opposed my campaign. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Thank you. So we are going to wrap it up there. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Thank you, Sami, for a really interesting debate. To close us off, can you leave us with a couple of things? Firstly, on the wider topic of this issue, what are your hopes? If you could just summarize what your hopes are, and what final words of advice or inspiration would you like to leave our audience with in relation to your work?
Yeah, what I hope for is for change to occur. I mean, I don't know how that change manifests itself. I don't know, but it can't just be sticking a plaque on it. I mean, that'd be the laziest result and laziest option to choose. And I just hope people can draw some inspiration from my campaign. And that, you know, I did get a lot of media coverage from my campaign last year, and it's important to realize that no matter how impossible odds feel, like, you know, you can affect change in some small meaningful way, which is what I think my campaign has done, in my opinion anyway.
That's cool. Thank you, Sami, so much. Thanks everyone for joining. That does bring our Black History Month 2021 LSB to a close. It has been a phenomenal program. So thank you for everyone who's come along to several events. It's been great to see you. Thanks for your support, and keep an eye out on our What's On pages for more events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.